But I don't think that we will ever be, or we will ever be able to supply the kind of in-depth product level knowledge on that side of things as other players will do, or as I would argue the companies themselves should do. And I think that is also the most promising thing I've seen, that through those impulses, through that structure that we gave, the companies really did develop a new kind of circularity mindset.
And today's guest here with me, so we're ready to roll. Welcome to the Circular Coffee Break podcast, where we will be talking about everything circular and beyond. My guest today is Justus Kammüller, Senior Manager, Sustainable Business and Markets at WWF Germany. I actually met Justus some years back when we were jointly working on the circular business assessment to basically help companies on their path to circularity. Today, I'm looking forward to talking with him about the great work WWF Germany has been doing to accelerate the transition of businesses and society towards circular economy and sustainability. Welcome to the show, Justus.
Thank you very much, Michael. Really glad to be here with you.
Great to have you. And maybe to get us started, could you maybe briefly introduce yourself and your work at WWF Germany to give our listeners a little bit of a background?
Of course. Thanks, Michael. So I came into WWF with a management focus. I had worked in industry for a digital strategy consultancy and for insurance companies. And my academic background was also management, which made me kind of the oddball at WWF. Now it's been 7 years, and the business and markets division at WWF has grown quite a lot. We've built up a consultancy. We have a markets division. We work in international economy topics. So it's a very different situation now than it was then. But back then, I came into WWF, and our approach to working with businesses, to be honest, was quite focused on communication. It was still a time in sustainability when no one really knew what to do. People knew there was something wrong about the climate. Nature wasn't in the best state, but people couldn't put numbers on it, or let's say businesses couldn't put numbers on it. I think that from the scientific perspective, of course, we knew more. But the conversation that you had with businesses was still quite educative, I would say. It was not so much co-creative. And the big pain point that we had when we started, and I would say that's also what the focus of my work was that we had this idea in our minds of creating these sustainability champions as companies, and we kind of knew what that meant on a meta level. But we had no idea what that meant in practice. We had some small projects that we knew how to do. As an example, we had supply chain projects where we created sustainability transparency. So those were things that we could work on. But what it really meant to be a sustainable business, we couldn't define. And that was obviously a huge problem. If you wanted to move companies in a certain way, you had to know the direction. And it couldn't just be, well, you have to be good, or you have to kind of have no climate impact. There has to be more than that. So that was my focus of my work, and that was my background.
Cool. Thanks, Justus. And I think, as you mentioned, it has changed tremendously. And I think WWF has been spearheading this very business-centric, company-centric, society-centric approach of really having an impact going beyond the more traditional approaches. Now, you've also developed the One Planet Business Framework and the Circular Economy Business Assessment. Basically 2 tools that are focused on helping companies really hands-on, very concretely in their transition towards sustainability and circularity. Could you briefly introduce what these tools are, but also what was the vision behind that? What was the idea for WWF to step in and create these tools that are in addressing mostly businesses and companies?
Sure. Maybe to start that question, if I go back to the beginning of my work, as I quickly outlined, there was not really a kind of sense of what exactly we wanted companies to change. But we were quite good at saying what they were doing wrong. So there was this sense, and I think it was NGO wide, that the companies were kind of the bad dogs, right? And you need to police them. There was definitely this kind of mostly almost like an ethical perspective, like a moral perspective, right? We are the good guys, and we know in what direction we have to go, and there's these companies that are just kind of disturbing the field, right? But I always came at it, because of my background, with immense respect for corporates and for the innovation that they bring to the world, and I looked at it from a much more positive lens. And my task, or my goal from the very beginning, was to bring those two things together. And I had this vision of creating a kind of roadmap. It later developed into a framework, which you've already named, of how companies can develop. And that really meant diving really deep down into management practices on the one hand, which was something that we didn't really do at all. We kind of set targets, but we didn't really bother with the management side of things. And I think that was a mistake. Or I don't think we chose to do it. I think we did it because we didn't have any other option, or we didn't have the competency to do it. And on the other hand, really define much more definitively, much more constructively, what do these grand societal schemes and targets and ideas really mean for corporates? And that was the starting point for the One Planet Business Framework. So in the first moment, we defined, firstly, what does it really mean? What is a One Planet business? What would that company look like? We went at it from the question of impact, of course. I think that was the first step, to look at, okay, you have these different themes of ecological and societal change or challenges, namely climate change, biodiversity, fresh water, pollution, and human rights topics, and we defined a kind of North Star for sustainability, and we called that One Planet Business. And then we went further, and as I said, went very deep down into management practices and asked, okay, what are the aspects, what are the topics within a company that you need to address to actually get in that direction? And that was a task that actually took us, I think, 3 years of development, 2 years of piloting, and we learned a lot from companies. We had some really amazing discussions and partnerships with companies to develop and iterate the framework. We went through at least 10 different versions of it. We went back and forth, zoomed in and zoomed out, and at the end of that journey, you can now use and employ the framework within your company. As a management tool, and as a tool to really create a long-term sustainability roadmap that goes beyond what you see in compliance practices nowadays, and that basically can be a 50-year plan, right? If you want to go that far. Even though I know European companies are not as open to those kind of long-term visions, but I think it's that is not such a bad practice the Anglo-Saxon companies have, that they do create this kind of North Star, and then they work towards it or work backwards from it, right? So that was the vision behind it, and that's how we obviously met, because we noticed quite early on that the topic of circularity was not well addressed, or let's say it was not adequately addressed, because it is, in a nutshell, I think, the most beneficial marriage of sustainability with management topics, because it's very easily relatable to business practices. There's not a lot of transition, not a lot of translation you have to do. And we were asked by companies to define what we did for climate, biodiversity, fresh water, and human rights for circularity. And then we there again noticed that we didn't have the right kind of competencies, or not enough of it. That's why I reached out to you, and that partnership bear one gigantic fruit, which is the CBA, the Circular Business Assessment, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well.
Great, thanks, Justus. And one thing you mentioned, I think, is very true. I mean, if you look back a couple of years, I don't know, 5-10 years, the discussion was very much about like doing right, doing wrong. This is the target. This is what you want to achieve. but there was not really a dialogue about how to get there. What could companies do? What does it mean across the company? And circularity, or even more broadly sustainability, is a very complex, multi-dimensional challenge that goes across the business, different parts of the business, the ecosystem, the value chain, the broader society is involved in that. And I think it has changed the dialogue. How do we talk about sustainability? How do we talk about circularity as we're just talking more knowledgeable about the topics and more solution oriented rather than just holding up the problems that are there? How do you experience that? How has the dialogue from your point of view changed with businesses, with companies, with business representatives, by being able to translating these sustainability topics that were always there in NGOs like WWF into something that's more tangible, more relatable for businesses? Has that had an effect on how businesses reacted to you approaching them and discussing these topics?
I mean, absolutely. I think it was a change on two different scales, and I'll start with the obvious one. You already gave me a lot of nice buzzwords. Tangible. It's usable. It's pragmatic. It's the framework itself brings this high level, meta, nice sounding, almost moral sounding discussion to a manageable level. And then you, as a company, you're not defending why you're doing what you're doing. You're talking about what you could do better. And I think that is a huge game changer in terms of the discussions that we're having. But I would say the much bigger change is that it changes the way that we approach companies from a kind of, carrot and stick, good and bad, moral perspective down to an eye-to-eye, let's work out the details of how we can get where we want to get thing, right? And that has changed my discussions with companies considerably. In the first year or two, where we didn't have this kind of an approach, it was more about bargaining and about forcing and about making things more apocalyptic than they are, even though that's something that's still going on, right? It's not something that's stopped. But within the discussions, that's how you got companies to do what you wanted them to do, right? And as I said in the beginning, we didn't even know what we really wanted. So that was always a tightrope walk that we had to do. And now with the framework, first of all, I can say quite sincerely that it's very interesting for companies to look at these things, right? In the pilots that we have, one of the most memorable moments was when we spoke to one of the big chemical companies, and the person we spoke to and that was leading the project on their side basically said, look at this question. It was a question about materials lost in the value chain, right? That's one of the aspects that we look at in the CBA. And she said, this was such an interesting dimension. We spoke to our sourcing teams, we spoke to our procurement teams, and they hadn't really looked at it from that perspective yet, right? And that was really an eye-opener for us, that the topics that we put in there, which we put in there through the work with companies, so there was obviously some kind of a knowledge sharing going on. We don't want to take all the, none of us want to take all the credit for ourselves. This was definitely a co-creative project. But those eye-opening moments really change the discussion. So I think that's what the framework did for our work. Of course, we would have to speak to the companies how long-term those impacts are. I think it is really important to be mindful of how it's actually used. So we've done the assessments, and our view or our experience from those assessments was that it really brought the discussion forward. We are still, of course, now in the phase of working through the problems and kinks in the assessment, and we are working on actually filling. Well, once you do the assessment, there are a lot of questions, right? And once you do the assessment, there's a lot that you can now do, right? Mm-hmm. So what that means is that you could fill all those blanks that companies now have with a lot of work. And I think that what we didn't realize in the beginning was that, there would be a lot of follow-up questions, right? And I guess that's a good thing. I think it's better to have people asking you questions than saying, "Oh, thanks, fine, see you later." But I think that will also be a kind of a test of time if the framework is able to build a platform that can support your company in its development on a long-term basis.
And absolutely. I think at the same time, what it helps to do is to break down this very abstract topic of circularity into smaller pieces, into this is what it means for your procurement, this is what it means for your product design, this is what it means for the different aspects of your organization. So exactly as you said, Justus, you can go to your counterpart or to your responsible person in the organization and say, hey, have you thought about circular design? Have you thought about circular sourcing? Have you thought about water usage, electricity, all of these different aspects to break it down very concretely in that context, which naturally makes it much easier to also discuss in the business context, because now you're not talking about a very abstract level that is everyone's and no one's responsibility, but you can talk with the person whose responsibility it is at the end of the day and who can really change something in that context.
Absolutely.
What are some of the hurdles, some of the difficulties you already mentioned? There's a lot of follow-up discussions, follow-up questions. Are there some like typical areas where companies follow up, where companies see quick wins or see that they can address something, or where they feel that they cannot address something, where they see still challenges, be it in the system, be it in their own organization? Are there some commonalities you're seeing?
Yes, absolutely. I would say that in terms of quick wins, I think that the question of broadening the space of the target setting is one that is always eye-opening for companies. And the other one I think that you mentioned is that you have a much broader look vertically, that you can look within the departments in your company, or horizontally if that's the way that you build up your matrix, into the different departments with the kind of people. That is definitely I think the quickest win, right? That is really an eye-opening experience. Most companies, before they come to us, they know circular economy through the Ellen MacArthur Foundation diagrams, right? And okay, these are just strategies that I could employ, recycling, reusing, etc. So that's a really good first important step, but it doesn't really help you so much with how to actually implement it in your company. I would say that, or let's ask the question the other way around. What makes circular economy within a company work well? And I would say that there's three main topics. One of them is you need the structure within your business. You need to really build up a structure around those principles. The second one is that you do the actual work of designing circular economy solutions. And the third one is stakeholder engagement. And I would say that what we've developed works especially with A and C. So with the structure and with engaging your stakeholders. It gives you a long-term plan. It gives you all the next steps. It shows all the vantage points that you have within your business. So it's really, really good at that. But I would say that one major hurdle or one major problem that the CBA cannot not solve or not fully solve, I think it prepares you for solving it, but it doesn't. There are a few steps that you still have to make. That's point B, which is that you, in the end, what really matters and what makes or breaks your strategy is if you go down to your shop floor, if you have a shop floor, or you go to your drawing board, if you have a drawing board, and you actually design the solutions. And that is much more complicated, right? That is all trial and error. I don't think that you can have a process for that, right? You can have a more or less effective process, but it's a hurdle that you can't design away. I think you have to test stuff, and you have to fall on your noses. You have to try things that you think sound great on your paper, and in the end you realize, well, your employees want to own the things that they buy from you. They don't want to rent them, right? So and then maybe 5 years later you realize now they want to rent them. They didn't before. Why didn't they before? Oh, I had this and this and this worked out wrong, right? So in the end, the circular economy is the same as any kind of innovation concept, and the same as any kind of concept. You have to test it, and you can create a wonderful blueprint for it in a strategy paper, in a PowerPoint. In the end, every business is different, and every business has different customers. Every market space is changing, so there's no way to get around that big hurdle, which is you have to create a product people want, and you have to create it in a way that people want it. And the circularity aspect is just one extra aspect, right? It's sold as something. If you look at the communication, like you do this and now everyone will want it, right? Who wouldn't want a phone that's modular and you can update everything and you can take out small parts and then everyone will want that one, right? Obviously, it didn't work that way, right? The Fairphone has not even close to the market share as the iPhone, and the iPhone, in terms of circularity, it does the lower circle stuff, but it doesn't do the front stuff, that one that really brings you the benefits, the ones that the circular economy talks about, right? So why is it that way? And I think that those questions the CBA can prepare, but it cannot solve. You have to still do that by yourself, and we are still learning in that regard as well.
That's a fantastic point, because I think at the end of the day, what you can naturally do, and that's true, as you pointed out, in all areas of innovation, you can set the frame, you can build the parameters around it, be it the processes, be it the enablement, be it the tools and all of that. But it's a lot about mindset change, mindset shift, about people, about companies approaching it. In one of the previous episodes of the Circular Coffee Break podcast, we talked about circularity being a multiplayer game. And I think that applies here as well, because naturally the company can do whatever the company wants to do. If the market is not ready, and I remember we did the CBA pilot with one of the retail companies, where they basically said, we're doing all of these circularity things in our organization, but no one is buying them. The market is not ready because our customers are very price sensitive. They're very sensitive for new fashion trends and so on and so forth. So whatever the company does needs to basically fit into the broader context of society, of customers, of stakeholders, of the regulatory framework. And I think that adds a level of complexity compared to other areas where you innovate, where you're more focused on yourself innovating and not necessarily need to involve a very broad ecosystem of various players in that context.
I think there's a really important point here that you make, and I think that you can drill it actually down to a certain factor, and that is that the mathematics of the circular economy are not of a first order principle, meaning that if you create a product that's circular, it will most likely be more expensive in the beginning. In the second order principle, meaning, okay, for society, for you as a customer in the long term, there you have mathematically provable benefits, right? But that is not the reality of most companies of how they work today, right? So and for most customers, right? You could say the same thing for organic products. Most likely, people that eat organic products will have less costs in the long term because they live more healthily. Most people don't do it, right? Even though if you'd ask them, do you think it's more healthy? They would say, yeah, probably. Probably the organic apple is more healthy. Probably it's better to eat pesticide-free, but they don't do it because they don't make that calculation. So I think that is an added layer of complexity. And I really like that way that you framed it as a multiplayer game. And I think that's something that is in the beginning stages of the circularity journey. You don't, as a company, I think you don't see that yet. You don't see that multi-dimensionality. That's a really good point, Michael.
Yeah, and just one of the things the CBA naturally enables you to do is somewhat measure where you are in different areas, measure, assess your circularity practices, your business models, your approaches. Could you maybe talk a little bit about why that is important from your point of view and why this was an emphasis in creating the CBA?
Sure. I mean, I can give you the kind of typical bumper sticker consultancy sentence: what you can measure, you can manage, right? But that would be a bit cheap. So I'll go a bit deeper. I mean, let's say this: the CE seems, because we talked about mathematics already, it seems like such a mathematical concept, right? It seems so easy, right? You're like, oh, you do this recyclability and you do this, and then the benefits go up, and etc. It's easy, but it is obviously much more than that, right? And as we already said, it's much more about finding the right business model and creating the right kind of innovations, looking at your market, knowing your customer really well. So it's much more multidimensional, and I think that's one point where the CBA really helps, because it broadens the measurability from a recyclability target or a recycled content target to all the dimensions that make sustainability, circularity in your business successful, right? And it goes right down to the Are you including circularity principles in your remuneration for your employees and your management, right? That's how far down it goes, which for some companies, actually, and I would say this can be a bit of an overkill, right? If you're working with smaller companies, there has to be some kind of adjustment. But for most companies, even if they don't employ that kind of work, they still get those impulses and they see, okay, that's how far down I have to go. Because as you said, it is a mindset shift. And a mindset shift, you have to enact on different levels. We heard really, and that's what I said before, we heard so many times from companies, oh, this point ABC helped me to kickstart a conversation with teams XYZ, right? So that's really one important thing. Maybe just a quick kind of anecdotal sidetrack. I worked on the CGR, the Circularity Gap Report, for 4 years, and obviously we had a huge task on our hands to create this kind of circularity metric, right? And I don't know, it's like at 8 or 9% now. I haven't read the last one, to be honest, but it's something around 10, right? And it was definitely the most difficult metric that we ever created, right? That I ever was part of. And I would argue it's almost the least influential, right? Mm-hmm. Because the aha effect is amazing. You're like, we're at 9.2% circularity. And then what does that do other than confirming your already existing like biases and fears, right? We're not circular, right? It doesn't really help you much further. What really helped, though, was something else. In the CGR, I think it was 2019, we created a kind of interventions vortex where we brought down that metric down to, okay, these are the 30 innovations across these 6 sectors that have this and this kind of a climate impact, this kind of a biodiversity impact, and that's why they're the 30 most important. That really changed the conversation on the ground. That's actually research that was effective. And I think the reason why that's so important is because as a company or as a person, you always have to shift between zooming in and zooming out. You have to, especially the most technical of concepts, right? And the circularity is a technical concept. So that's how I think the CBA helps you. It gives you these kind of meta targets and makes it measurable, makes the circularity in your company measurable in that regard. But it also goes down and says, okay, that's what it means for strategies. That's what it means for your sourcing. That's what it means for your business development. And I think that's what really helps with managing it, right? So it's not just a mathematical measurement; it's an actual functions-based measurement. That's what I would call it.
No, absolutely, and I think that's very critical to really be able to discuss with the different parts of the organization in their terms and basically be able to link it back to their targets, to their operations, to their activities, so that they see what impact they can have instead of contributing to an abstract target that no one really knows how they're rolling into, because it's something that's measured very far away from where the actual work is being done. Now, the journey towards circularity, we very often now talked about cultural shift, mindset shift within a company, but also the broader society. How do you see WWF Germany now, but also in future, basically contributing to furthering that mindset shift, that operational change that needs to happen in companies in order to reach circularity and more broadly sustainability? And on the other side also, I assume the CBA, the One Planet Business Framework, is not only a way for you to help companies to contribute to companies and talk to companies, but also the other way around, to learn more about what are the challenges in companies, but more in society as well. How do you see WWF Germany play a role in shaping that landscape going forward and in really accelerating that shift towards circularity with the help of these tools, but also with the help of the knowledge and insight that you're basically generating with these tools?
That's a great question. I think that in the way that you frame the question is exactly the way that I would answer it. So if you had stopped at the point, how can we help with the CBA, etc., my answer would have been, I think we have to be very modest, because the CBA is a basis for a cultural shift, and we are proud of it. I think that we created a good tool. It gives you great structure. It is It can help you create a long-term battle plan, right? It has a lot of benefits. But if you had stopped there, I would say I can't give us much more credit than creating a basis, right? I would say that the most important learning we had over the last 3 years is that if you want to really go beyond that impulse, because that's really what it is, right? It's an impulse. It's a restructuring. Well, it goes beyond the impulse. It actually is a restructuring as well. But if you want to go beyond that and see it through, you have to do what good consultancies nowadays do. And that has something to do with actually creating really in-depth market product knowledge, right? And I have to be honest that it's something that as WWF is a big task for us, because we cannot move too far away from our product. And our product obviously is not the CBA. It's not the One Planet Business Framework. It's nature. That is our core product, right? That is our core value. And so we stray down into that pathway sometimes, but I don't think that we will ever be able to supply the kind of in-depth product level knowledge on that side of things as other players will do, or as I would argue the companies themselves should do. And I think that is also the most promising thing I've seen, that through those impulses, through that structure that we gave, the companies really did develop a new kind of circularity mindset, especially the ones in the pilots. Like, I was really surprised, and in a positive way surprised as how much that moved the needle. But I wouldn't say it was us doing it, right? We gave that kind of basis, we gave that kind of impulse. But in the end, if you get a company to create this new kind of structure and create this new kind of mindset, and they then go down to the shop floor. I come from an industry background. That's why I always talk about shop floors. But they go down to the shop floor. They talk to the engineers. They look at the machines and they say, okay, this and this and this and this is what we could change from that perspective. The same way as people are doing it now with AI. Then you've done what you were there to do. Is my perspective from WWF, and the rest, the actual designing, bringing to market, we act as a kind of sparring partner in that regard. But as much as I would like to get my hands dirty on the shop floor, because that's what I was used to from back in the day, I don't think it's something where we can add the most value, right? So I think that we have to be very humble and respectful in that regard, and let the companies do that by themselves, and act as a kind of critical friend, and continue to make the points that we're making. That's the way I see it. Maybe it sounds a bit unambitious if I hear myself saying it, but I think it comes out of a deep respect for the work that companies do, and the innovativeness and where it comes from. That's no small feat. The companies that are global players for 50 plus years, there's a reason for that, right? And it's the innovative, creative potential that's within the structures and the minds of the people working there, and you can never reproduce that from the outside.
I think that makes perfect sense. I think you cannot force this onto companies, but they need to develop this. They need to take this on board, exactly as you said. The coffee is empty, unfortunately, and it's time to wrap up this episode of the Circular Coffee Break podcast. Thanks, Justus, for joining me today. Really insightful and really interesting conversation.
Thank you very much, Michael.
For all of you listening, we hope you found today's episode interesting and inspiring. If you like the podcast, you can help us grow the Circular Coffee Break community by giving us a 5-star rating and a positive review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And also, please remember to subscribe to stay in the loop on new episodes that will drop every 2 weeks, with a lot of interesting guests to come in the second half of this year. The only thing left for me is to thank all of you for listening today, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all here at the Circular Coffee Break podcast.